In the United States, we have a tendency again to think of poverty as something anomalous. We think of poverty as a third world issue, right? Too often, thanks to mass media images, we feel sorry for folks in India. We feel terrible about hunger in Africa, and so on. And of course, I'm not denying that poverty is a big issue in many of these developing nations in the world, poorer nations in the world. Of course, there's a deep historical as well as contemporary factors for global poverty. But in this segment, I do want to focus on poverty as it exists in the United States. Hunger and food insecurity that exist right here in the United States, right here in the Bay Area. Many of our college students are food insecure, are homeless, right? Many of the students at the CSUs, UCs live in their cars. Okay, so this is a very, very widespread problem. So the fact is that poverty is as American as apple pie. And even though in the political rhetoric you keep hearing about our bloated social programs that are irresponsible and unsustainable, etc., the reality is that in the developed world, we have one of the thinnest welfare systems. We often refer to it as the greased chute, right? From Chutes and Ladders. A greased chute means that we have basically no safety net. And we like to think of the poor as some other folks over there who have their own subculture and so on. But the reality is that many of us are really close to that. You have one medical emergency and you lose your job and you're there, right? There is no safety net to catch you. Okay. So our welfare system is very minimal. In fact, scholars refer to us as the corporate welfare state because of the incentives we give to corporations, the breaks we give to the very rich in our society. Poverty is also systemic, right? It's not like, oh, all of a sudden a recession brought this or the pandemic brought this. No. Poverty is very systemic. It's part of the capitalist system that we have created through our policymaking. It comes at a very high price. Hopefully, by now, as sociologists, you're seeing the links between all these different institutions, right? So housing is connected to health, is connected to education, is connected to work, right? So when you have very, very high poverty rates, it's essentially hurting our human capital. It's increasing rates of crime, it's increasing health issues, right? So in fact, folks will point out that anti-poverty policies make economic sense for our nation, right? So it's not just due to moral or humanitarian reasons that we are arguing that we need to really have policies in place to ameliorate poverty, but it makes economic sense because poverty comes at a very high price. If you don't tackle with this issue, you will have to pay the price in terms of how many folks will have to use the healthcare system, how many folks will be incarcerated, how many folks won't receive an education, and so on and so forth. And then a lot of our segment will also focus on how we implement policies that are based on a blaming the victim logic rather than aim at solving structural systemic issues, right? So our policies are based on what we will unpack as the culture of poverty kinds of thesis rather than as structural reasons that lead to poverty in the first place. So if you were to list the poverty myths and facts, one of the myths, which is kind of an alarmist way of thinking about this, is, oh, so do you want us to redistribute the whole wealth? Do you want us to become a socialist country, right? And that's a big deal in the US because it's seen as basically that you are a traitor if that's what you are proposing. But the reality is that there are so many steps before we talk about a complete redistribution of wealth, right? So many steps in between of strategies that are known to reduce the wealth gap. Raising taxes for the rich, reforming our labor market, increasing the minimum wage, making college free, providing health benefits for all, providing free education for all, higher education, retirement benefits, right? There's so much research that provides evidence that these are strategies that work, right? But I think presenting it as an either or again makes people think, well, I don't want socialism, right? But again, the reality is that there are many steps in between, right? The other argument is that, oh, it's too complicated. It's too big a problem. It's too complicated. There's nothing we can do about it. It's inevitable, right? And again, the reality there is that the consequences of poverty may be complex, right? In terms of how it affects your identity, how it affects your opportunities for schooling and work, your health outcomes, all of those things, right? But the causes are well known, right? So the causes of poverty are well known. And we have a tendency to just keep saying, oh, it's too much. It's too big a problem, right? Another argument you'll often hear is that, oh, we're in economic recovery. You just need more patience. Like the trickle down will happen eventually. And the reality is that the real growth for the 99% of our population has been zero, right? Often economists do this calculation, right? There's hardly been any growth in wages. And of course, most of us live paycheck to paycheck. So that means we don't have any extra left over to invest, right? And then finally, again, the inevitability of how, well, all countries are unequal. Indeed, economic inequality is a global problem. But we know again from evidence that income concentration and the top tax rate are strongly correlated. Countries that have implemented policies where you tax the super rich, the very wealthiest sections of our population, have been able to close the gap when it comes to income and wealth. So this is why I like to assign Greg Mantsios, who talks about media magic, a lot of these myths that are perpetuated by mass media stereotypes, right? Both in terms of the popular culture and news stories that we consume. And if you break it down, one of the first ideas he's presenting is that in the US, we all like to imagine ourselves as middle class. It's the safe segment to be in, precisely because in the media, we make fun of the poor. Right? If you're in an equal opportunity society and you're poor, it must be because of your own fault, right? So no one wants to be seen as poor. Poor and working class people hardly ever have fair portrayals. They remain invisible most of the times. And then when they are portrayed, you see folks like Homer Simpson or the king of the Queens guy, King of Queens, they're seen as lazy, crude, mostly want to sit in a couch and watch sports and guzzle beer with their pals. That's the portrayal we have of working class folks. Meanwhile, folks don't want to say they're rich either, because then you would be seen as rich and evil, right? So most folks, irrespective of whether they are making 50,000 a year or 5 million a year, would like to be seen as middle class, perpetuating the idea that class doesn't really matter in the US. Pull yourselves up by your bootstraps and look, you could be the next Oprah. So we love our rags to riches stories. We even pretend that one of the Jenner sisters, who's the youngest billionaire, was self-made, right? So there are actually very few authentic bootstrappers in the US, right? We think of ourselves as the land of equal opportunity, upward mobility. Meanwhile, the poor are seen as this faceless, undeserving eyesore. If we're lucky, we see them as down on their luck. If we're not being very kind, then we like to think of the poor as lazy, undeserving, right? And as I was saying, the reality is that many of us are very close to that situation. Meanwhile, the wealthy, we've always been infatuated with the rich. When I was in high school, it used to be the lifestyles of the rich and the famous. Now, after that, it was MTV Cribs, and now this fascination with the Kardashians and other reality stars. We idolize the rich. We like to elect them into Congress again and again, right? Thinking that, oh, if you were a savvy businessman, somehow you will know how to run the country, right? So we again and again in surveys find that middle class folks, even working class folks, are more likely to see themselves as victims of reverse racism, as victims of immigration, right, rather than as victimized by a capitalist economy and neoliberal policies, right? We have a tendency to internalize a lot of these media stereotypes. So in our next segment, we will discuss at length the culture of poverty. Where did these ideas come from? That the poor are lazy, and by the way, in a very racialized way. So when we talk about welfare and welfare queens, who are we talking about? Which groups are we targeting when we blame the poor for being lazy and for having too many babies out of wedlock, right? So very important part of our discussion of how we perceive the poor and how that shapes our policy making then has to engage this discussion of racial stereotypes.